Hi, I'm Albert Pasaoa,
Hello, my name is Kevin Jefferies.
and this is the 635 Podcast. The 635 Podcast is about local politics, economics, and social and cultural issues in the Alvin Community College area. The views expressed on the show are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of Alvin Community College. Welcome back to the podcast, the 635 Podcast, here with Kevin Jefferies, and I'm Albert Pasaoa. And today we're going to talk about the Legislative Budget Board of Texas. So, Kevin, explain what is this thing, because I've never heard of it before.
Well, it's a mysterious organization. It's only been around since the 40s. It is the organization that's responsible for overseeing the formation of the budget in the state of Texas when it has been sent from the governor's office to the legislature at the beginning of the legislative session, the regular session. Remember, it meets every other year, to oversee the formation of the budget through the legislative session. And when it is done, it produces a document, and this is what I wanted to look at. In my classes, we're doing it right now, the Fiscal Size-up, which is if you ever have any kind of questions about money on the state level, this is the place to go because it details it. They just recently came out with the one for the last general appropriations bill, because remember, we don't have a budget so much as we have an appropriations bill that contains a list of all the items that can be drawn, or let's say which agencies can draw how much from the state treasury. It's sort of like a checkbook. That's the way I kind of like to describe this. And so what this document that I want to kind of run through a little bit, I'm doing it with my classes right now, does is oversee this, describe, the political circumstances, where the money's coming from. And that's an especially important thing because when people talk about the nature of taxes, we recently had tax day. One thing that's important to know is, where the revenue is collected, how it's collected, where does it go. So if you have any kind of, curiosity or you want to deal with some of this stuff, this is the way that you do it.
So these are actual projections of the way money will be spent?
That's the right word to use, projections, because right now we don't know. The way the budget works in the state of Texas, on an ongoing basis, you're dumping money into the general revenue fund every time you purchase something, every time you get some gasoline. In that case, you would be paying into the state highway fund. There's 400 of these different areas of specific funds within the state of Texas. And the Texas Comptroller's Office, part of what they're supposed to do is to estimate how much they think within a particular period of time is going to be earned, because the state of Texas constitutionally, in terms of its general revenue fund anyway, can't spend more than it collects in that 2-year period. But the problem with that, of course, is that we're in that 2-year period. It started last September 1st of 2021, and it is going to go till August 31st of 2023. So what is that, a year and a half, almost ahead. And so there's a lot of projections that have to be made. You don't know precisely how much is going to be spent until it's already been spent.
So the tax collection is variable. It depends on sales and collection, but why is the spending variable? I mean, is that they adjust their spending based on projections of how much money will be coming in?
Well, or how much need there is. I mean, think about where we are. We're at Alvin Community College, and we get money from the state that's based on head count. We don't know how many people are going to take classes around here.
Okay.
That's why we do our one of the things I mentioned in class, when we get the 12th class day, the final, what do we call it again? The roll or whatever? I can't remember.
Census.
This census date, yeah, exactly.
Point of fact, our funding is based on contact hours,
Well,
not head count.
well, it's related. The total, all right, so we're dealing with minutia right here. The total contact hours, which is the total amount of time that a particular head is either on campus or online. There's a number, basically. I mean, the point being that it is variable to the sense that we don't know how many people are gonna want it. It's the same sort of thing on the national level as well, too. One of the major areas of expenditure actually comes from the national government. It's based on how many people actually apply for Medicaid. We don't know ahead of time. I mean, again, part of what the comptroller's office does is try to estimate what sorts of things are likely to occur, but things happen. For example, it may be at some point in the future you have some kind of bug, that might lead to a pandemic, that leads to shutdowns. No one can predict those sorts of things, or a housing bubble might burst, or who knows, maybe one country might decide to invade another. And that's, you can't factor those sorts of things in. So it's never precise, but it is within an area of estimation.
Okay, so I like that. We got uncertainty about the money coming in. We have uncertainty about the money going out. So what does this thing say, the Legislative Budget Board?
Well, again, the staff, if we back up a little bit and look at the fiscal size-up, the staff of the Legislative Budget Board puts this thing together, and I think you're talking about 150 people or so. It's the board that are the staff. Again, these are the people that do the work. The people that are officially part of it are members of both the House of Representatives and also the Senate, the Texas House of Representatives, the Texas Senate. The chairs, the presiding officer of each respective chamber is going to be the joint chair. So Dan Patrick is, as Lieutenant Governor, is one of the two joint chairs. Dade Phelan, one of the representatives who happens to be Speaker of the House, is the other one. And we have a variety of other individuals, including two people from our local area, Larry Taylor, who is currently our senator. He's not running for re-election, but he's still the senator. And Greg Bonin, also from Friendswood, very close by representative. So those are two of the individuals that are on that as well, too. But again, they oversee this process. So this would actually be the staff that puts this together, overseen by the director. Jerry McGinty is the fellow's name, and I'm kind of scrolling through it right now. But they provide this number. Now, one thing we might want to look at, they have some the state budget overview. So if you're curious about how much, in fact, the state of Texas spends, and again, remember, it's a 2-year budget. You can see it. What page is it? I'm scrolling down just a little bit. Page 2. Page 1 gives you a sense about where all the money comes from. And you have 4 general categories. One is general revenue funds. And that's like a pot of cash it's mostly your sales taxes that go into this. And it's the kind of thing that can get flipped around from place to place. And this is what, you asked a great question a second ago about, do we know where the money is going to be spent? Well, sometimes it can be shifted from one fund to the other, depending upon circumstance. Because again, you don't know. We might have a hurricane. Hopefully we don't. And certainly that's going to affect expenditures. We, for example, one thing that's mentioned here, embedded, but there's been a lot of interesting stuff written about Operation Lone Star, the governor's effort to try to deal with issues on the border. And there's a lot of money that's been, shifted from one fund to another in order to deal with this, the increased revenue associated with it. And so sometimes that's the general revenue fund where you can see some of that shifted around. General revenue dedicated funds, and I believe that's where you would also find things, again, general revenue, but going to a particular area of expenditure. Mentions the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality being one of those areas that, again, you're paying into the general revenue fund, but it's dedicated for a particular thing. Other funds, when you decide you want to go get some gasoline, you're paying into the State Highway Fund, and that is directed towards the Texas Department of Transportation. And this provides a little bit of convenience in the sense that the money that is going to be used to, use this particular service and potentially wear it down, I'm talking highways, is used to, upkeep highways. So there's a relationship between the amount of money in the fund and also the expenditures of that money, where that's going to go.
Okay, this could look overwhelming. So let's go over and just look at the big items, and because, if you were to ask me what, where does the majority of fund money go to, it's, wouldn't actually be quite clear. I would guess education or something. So
the number one. Let's go through the list here. And by the way, I do want to mention one other thing in terms of a very important source of funding, and this is the one single largest source of funding, and that's from the federal government. So most of what Texas gets in terms of a particular area is from the federal government. I mentioned Medicaid and highway transportation a second ago. But in terms of what you were talking about, one way we can look at it, actually, if we look at page 2, you see funding by article, all funds, and you see these, looks like globes or whatever.
Yeah.
You see it's divided into 12 different articles, and Article 12 is interesting. Let's focus on that in just a second. Article 3 is the largest one. That tells us where most state money is going, and that's agencies of education. And if you look to the left, you can see the contents. There's a separate section that takes you to Chapter 6 on agencies of education. It'll mention the Texas Education Agency there.
Okay, so education is 36%. So
36% of all funds, yes.
Of the budget.
Yeah.
Now, when you say all funds, this is all Texas-generated funds?
Well,
or?
no, this is, remember a second ago I mentioned general revenue funds, general revenue dedicated, federal funds, and also these other funds.
Okay.
And so that's what that means, all of those things together. And and a little bit further down, it has it divided up into different areas with the sources. And that gives you an idea about, again, where the money comes from for different things. Health and Human Services, which is number 2. Most of that is federal funds.
Yeah, so 33%. So roughly a third to education and a third to health and human services. But as you mentioned, the health and human services, most of it comes from federal money?
Yes,
Okay.
and actually we can scroll down a little bit and we can actually see that. If you look at the next one, business and economic development, about 4/5 of that is for highway construction. And that's an important thing to understand because, we drive around a lot, especially around here. We see a lot of highways being built. Where does the money come from? Well, there you go. And the bulk of that, again, also is federal funds. Because most of what we have here not only even if it's a state highway, it's also an interstate as well. So it qualifies for federal funding. I may have mentioned this a little bit before because I think, some time ago when we were talking about area highway construction, there was a class where we looked at the funding for the improvements on 288, and it was a little bit more than $1 billion, and with the exception of $17 million, it was all federal. The only thing that the state kicked in was for the little spur that goes off into the medical center up north of the loop.
Okay, and then let's go through all these. This is really interesting. Public safety and criminal justice, 5% of
prisons, penitentiaries.
That includes prisons. Okay, so
Yes.
5%. So that includes. So this is state funding.
Yes.
So it's not going to include law enforcement done at the
Local level.
Local level.
Yes, that
okay.
would be local. That's the same thing with education, by the way. That the money that you see, and by the way, it's $96 billion over a 2-year period of time. That doesn't take into consideration property taxes collected at the local level. And actually, the second chapter, when it says revenue sources, if you look at the contents page right now, that's where you can get an indication of the total amount of property taxes. It doesn't break it down per independent school district or community college district or whatnot, but to the total amount of property taxes collected.
Okay. And then, one other thing. So for public safety, what statewide law enforcement is there?
Department of Public Safety.
And then what do they do? I mean, if they're not doing local.
Well,
right?
they wear hats. They pull you over. They kind of have that little sort of sheriff-looking kind of walk that they do, pulling you over and call you boy.
They're equivalent to California's Highway Patrol.
Exactly. Eric Estrada.
Chips.
Is he still
wow.
Is he
There's
still
the
a thing?
old reference. Yes.
There you
Chips.
go. Old school.
Love Chips.
It's not. I'm glad you asked that question because they've been topical recently. Because normally what they do is, again, law enforcement on the highways. That's primarily what they do. Law enforcement is mostly a local issue in the state of Texas. But more controversially, over the last week or two, those were the individuals that were implementing the governor's decision to search trucks on the border just a little bit more. So you had United States Border Control doing their normal searches of trucks, and the governor wanted additional searches, which created this log jam. I think some trucks were waiting for about 36 hours to go forward. It was DPS that was responsible for doing that.
I see. And, just a casual observation, I see way fewer cars being pulled over on Texas freeways than I do in California. I'm sort of curious about the levels of enforcement across state. I mean, I just have the general impression that in Texas it's a little more lax. I don't know, maybe that might explain part of the car accident differentials or something.
I don't know. That's a great question. If you want to follow up a little bit with these small little bubbles down here, there's an unusual one. If you look on the far right, you see Article 12. That's 13 billion bucks from the American Rescue Plan.
And that's
And
5%.
that was COVID related. And this has never existed before. I'm pretty certain it's not going to be there in the next, well, let's hope not anyway, the next time the legislature meets. But if you go back about 10 years or so, you'll see something from the American Recovery Act. You'll have these temporary stimulus efforts or whatnot. And this is one of the things that's sort of interesting in getting into the details here, because there's a lot of stuff that's kind of hidden in plain sight right here. Money that was coming to the states from the national government for the stated purpose of dealing with local expenditures related to COVID relief and whatnot. Let's say hospitals that spent more money than they normally do in terms of emergency room visits and whatnot. People that are on ventilators. Sometimes that money is sent elsewhere. So I think that the money that comes in sometimes is used to justify cuts elsewhere.
Does that fall under the category of block grants, like federal block grants to states? Is that
that I don't believe does.
Okay.
It might, though. I'd have to look at this, but when you're talking, but a lot of the money does that we're looking at here, Health and Human Services and whatnot. Business and economic development, if you look at that, you'll see a lot of housing grants, and that stuff would be either block grants or categorical grants or whatnot. But yeah, in a sense, you could say so. Now, again, this being a one-time thing, I'm not sure exactly how they would define these, but the matching grants, probably in a looser sense, that would probably be the appropriate way to look at it.
I think my recommendation to the person who made these graphics, it would be awesome if they converted these to pie charts where they broke it down state, federal.
Hold on a second. Let's scroll down a little. Let me mention something, because they do that.
Okay.
This is just a first crack at
All
it.
right.
This is page 2 out of 632.
Yeah,
so we're just getting into this.
This is a 24-hour marathon podcast.
Oh, more, yeah. It would be, it's like a Jerry Lewis.
Send donations for us to stop. But let's talk about all these other tiny ones.
Let's go from left to right. So
Okay.
Article 1, general government, those are primarily executive agencies, with the exception of the regulatory agencies you see further off to the right, Article 8. This is the money for the governor's office, the money for the attorney general, the money for the comptroller, and a bunch of smaller ones as well, too. Now, these are listed. You go further down, you'll see all those things listed. And what's interesting with the governor's money, the governor got quite a bit more than the governor's office did in the 2020, 2021 budget. And a lot of this was for the purposes of giving him a pot of money to deal with border issues. So if you go over to Article 4, you'll see the judiciary. We spent $971 million on the state courts, which really isn't a lot.
Yeah.
One of the things we cover when we get into the judiciary in the state of Texas
compared to law enforcement, right? I mean,
well, actually, compared to where we were 10 years ago, we had 5 million fewer people, or 20 years ago, we had 10 million fewer people. So we have a lot more, let's say, demand for these. Now, natural resources, most of this actually goes to the Department of Agriculture, and there are other issues related to this as well. Also, the management of public lands in the state of Texas, because Texas, was it 12 million acres, something like that, it continues to own on its own. Regulatory institutions, now that $734 million for funding, I think it's something like 25 or 30 different regulatory institutions, which underestimates the impact of these things, because they're the ones that really make the rules that affect the well-being of different areas of business
and that,
within the state of Texas.
That reminds me of the where would the energy organization that got a lot of heat because
Railroad Commission?
No, they got a lot of heat because of the freeze 2 years ago.
ERCOT.
ERCOT. Are they funded? Are they part of an agency?
They would be, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I believe they would be either regulatory or general government. We can find out. You know how we can find out? Tell you what, let's do this real quick, since that's a question on the table. If we go to number 4, you see number 4, we can click on that. You see general government.
Okay. So
and there's your pie chart, by the way.
Oh.
So 66% of the funding for general government, and that's running the executive institutions, comes from the General Revenue Fund.
I see.
Yeah, and then there's some of it's dedicated, some of it is federal, some of it is other. And again, when you say other, the 200, 300, 400 other funds, there's tons of these things that are out there. Now, scrolling down a little bit, the next page, figure 51, if you're on that, you can see what they have listed, and I don't think I see ERCOT there. It might be either it might be regulatory.
Okay, so let me just comment for the listeners there. For the general government money, the federal funds is 14%
Yes.
of that. Okay, that's larger than I thought it would be, just for something that would be called general government. Okay, and then
It's not an actual general, just so you know. We're not talking about an actual part of the military.
Yeah.
When you say general
I
government.
would just think, just to pay for upkeep of the state offices.
Well, that would, well, since you mentioned that, if you see the Facilities Commission, it's about, 10 down or something like that. And that's an interesting one, too, because, can you find it? Facilities Commission?
Facilities Commission. So
Between the Texas Ethics Commission and the Public Finance Authority.
this is the figure 21? I'm
51.
sorry, 51.
Can you see it?
Okay, what was it
Starts
called
with the
again?
Commission on the Arts, Facilities.
Commission on the Arts. Uh-huh.
Well, that's the one up on top. If you go down about 10, 12, you'll see Facilities Commission.
Facilities Commission.
Since you mentioned buildings and stuff, these were the people who would do that sort of thing.
Okay,
Now,
that's-
notice something. Go off to the right. You see the first column. That's estimated budgeted for 2020, 2021, $1,017 million bucks. And if you notice right next to it, it's down to $150 million. And again, part of what we've been doing in classes is kind of looking at this. Is this where some of the money was redirected, towards the governor's office for border issues? We don't know. I mean, it's not some things
I
it
see.
specifically gets into, some
So
things
there's
it
a
doesn't.
sudden drop of money for facilities,
Yeah.
and that's being projected coming up. And
We're still looking for ERCOT, though, right? Do you want to look at the regulatory institutions? This is what's cool about it. They didn't always have this little content
okay.
thing on the. Yeah, let's look at regulatory. And again, this is relatively small, 732 million. And if you see again here, general revenue funds, general revenue dedicated funds, respectively 41, 45%. Very little bit in terms of federal funds, other funds about 12%. Some of it is because some of these regulatory institutions actually get fees from the industries that they regulate. And so they kind of can pay for themselves
Okay.
as a consequence of that. But I still don't see ERCOT. I see Public Utility Commission towards the bottom, 42 million down from
Well,
33
I mean,
million.
maybe ERCOT is self-supporting through its, I don't know, fees on
don't
energy
see ERCOT.
producers.
I don't know.
I mean, my general impression was it was some type of just group of producers who seem
Well,
to
they oversee
They
that,
oversee,
yes. And they're affiliated with the Public Utility Commission. I'd have to check it out. Anyway, you see the Texas Racing Commission, Department of Insurance, which is surprisingly large. That's the largest area of expenditures for regulations. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that when you're talking about Department of Insurance, you're also talking about the different estimators that go out when something occurs. So there are a lot of individuals who would be working.
Where's the
for
Racing
them.
Commission? I'm curious about
It's
that.
towards the bottom, Texas Racing Commission, I think 5 up from the top.
Texas Racing Commission. So
Mhm.
these are in millions,
13 million, yeah.
13 million to
Yeah.
oversee what, dog racing?
Yeah, we do have horse races too.
Horse
It just really hasn't taken off. In fact, I think that all right, I think I mentioned earlier, there's a thing called the Sunset Review Commission, which will, every 12 years, all of these have to justify themselves effectively. And they can be changed, they can be terminated. And that was the suggestion for the Texas Racing Commission for it, not so much to be terminated, but I think it was to be absorbed into something else. And I can't remember what that was. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head what exactly the decision was, but I think the reason was because horse racing, dog racing didn't really pick up like people thought that it was going to be. We didn't turn into the next Kentucky.
Oh, was this a relatively new thing they were trying to
I think
push?
was it about 20, 25 years ago or so that suddenly we had horse races?
I think so. That's probably when the lottery was also established.
About that time too, around 1980 or so. Yeah.
ERCOT is a nonprofit organization.
Okay. So that would not be part of.
Okay,
this.
so ERCOT is a nonprofit
Nonprofit.
organization.
So this would be
they're-
one of the different sorts of organizations outside the governing structure itself.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you what. You want to do this? I don't think we want to spend too much
Yeah.
time on this. But if we want to hit the big stuff,
Sure.
if we want to hit agencies of education,
Okay, let's go to
the
education.
number one area of expenditure in the state of Texas, and this helps explain also, a lot of the attention that's given to public education. And it's broken down into two, K through 12 and also higher education.
Okay, so there's agencies of education. Let's get the big picture here. So education is the biggest one. Federal funds is 16.5%.
Now, by the way, what we're looking at right here is K through 12. That's public
Okay.
education. A little bit below, you're going to see higher ed. General revenue funds, 65.4. Other funds, you don't have any dedicated funds there. And this also, it's very complex. Foundation school program, a bunch of other things are related to this. If you look at higher education, you have some dedicated funds, general revenue, federal funds, other funds, a total of $23 billion to go to all the colleges within the state of Texas.
So we have a increase in all these different categories. The 5% increase of general revenue funds and
Mhm.
other funds. What's this other funds, really quick?
Off the top of my head, this would include the Permanent University Fund, Higher Education Assistance Fund, that are supplemental to the systems of the University of Texas and A&M, and also to University of Houston and Texas Tech and whatnot,
Okay.
and a variety of others. You know, again, like I said, you have 200 or so of these different things that are out there. So anyway, that gives you just a general overview. If anybody's curious about, you know, where the specific money comes from, it's a good place to look at it. And it details, for example, the agricultural programs that A&M runs. You know, you got the technical colleges, health-related institutions as well, which of course now includes U of H because they recently were given the authority to have a medical school. Now, in terms of particular agencies, again, you know, if anybody's interested in getting into some specifics associated with the Texas Education Agency money for this particular period of time, right now you've got that. I think it's page 206. Established 1949. There's the authorizing statute, what allows it to exist, the
Wait.
Texas Education Code.
Wait, which category is this under?
Education, Texas Education Agency.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Primary purpose to oversee primary and secondary public education system in Texas through the distribution of state and federal funding. Now remember, again, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but when we think about federal funds, generally the federal funds go through the state of Texas on their way to local governments, if those are ultimately the people that are going to be spending money on these. And that's certainly the case with things like health and human services.
Now, what determines the federal funds? Is it just every state, like per student, and the federal government has some formula that they send out, or are there other considerations that they would make to increase the per pupil spending?
Now, the funding for the expenditures for federal funds really generally aren't so much directly for education. They can be things related to, let's say, the nature, you know, access that handicapped students with
Okay.
disabilities might have, things of that nature.
Mhm.
Most of what happens, well, you know, we could have a particular podcast where we just look at the different types of funding for education, because it, you know, it stuff happens on the local level, stuff happens on the state level, stuff happens on the federal level. On the local level, you know, again, with bonds that are offered from time to time, that's how you build your buildings. When we're talking about things like salaries and whatnot, maintenance operation, that's primarily the state stuff. And again, compliance with equal protection clause and things, that's national government. And again, that's a kind of a simplistic way to look at it, because it gets a lot more, you know, intricate following that. Because you have some legislation that certainly impacts expenditures that are conditioned upon not discriminating on the basis of gender, you know, like Title II. And so, again, some of the money that gets is oriented towards addressing that. Did
Okay.
you want to maybe look at Health and Human Services?
Before we go there, I'm just pulling up that table that breaks down the general, like Lamar State Colleges, Texas
Mhm.
State Colleges,
Mhm.
and then community college breakdown. Can you go over again? So general academic institutions, those are mostly K through 12.
Oh, no. With higher education, general academic, that would be your U of H's, your A&M's, your Texas Tech, University of Texas, places like that.
Okay.
And then the three lower division institutions, I think that's like your Lamar, Texas, that. 50 community junior college districts, that includes us. 13 health-related institutions, University of Texas, medical system, things like that. Dental, veterinary. So So there you go. Now the other thing too, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is interesting to look at here as well too. If you want to kind of understand how higher education policy is put together within the state of Texas. Back in the 1960s, I think John Connolly was governor during this period of time. There was this feeling that universities weren't cooperating with each other. In other words, and they kind of had like this zero-sum attitude.
Yeah.
The only way I'm going to expand or get better is to undermine you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of this was looking at UT and A&M kind of going at each other, and also making it difficult for other Texas Tech and University of Houston to become viable institutions as well too. And so the idea with the Higher Education Coordinating Board was to have this entity that could oversee the programs these other schools can get into to make sure that they coordinate with each other. They're not interfering. They're collectively doing, spending state money in the way that is most effective for the needs of the state, higher education needs for the state. So when, again, I mentioned a little while ago, University of Houston a few years ago wanted to have a medical school go in that particular direction, and I guess there were some concerns in the state level whether we had too many medical schools already, but apparently, while they seemed to agree with that, they said, well, we don't have enough doctors in underserved communities. And so U of H was like, well, we'll primarily focus on that sort of thing. So that's the principal thing that they're doing with their med school because it was approved.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so what else is there?
Well, if you very quickly want to, let's say, look at the other two top areas of expenditures, health and human services and business and economic development. Maybe we can leave it for that right now. But second largest area of expenditure in the state, but the largest source of federal funds, that's what makes this interesting, is health and human services. And this is actually implemented at the lower level. If you look at where the money's coming from, 58%, almost 60% is from the national government. And let's see, and that has gone down quite a bit. It went from $97 billion to $86 billion. Again, this is as I mentioned, the American Rescue Plan money that came in. Did this justify cutbacks in the normal expenditures within the legislature? That's one of the things that critics will say. Criticisms that people will lob at the Texas legislature when it gets supplemental funding like that. Instead of actually using the money to go for the services that are intended, it's used to justify cutbacks in the overall budget. General revenue funds is the bulk of the rest of it, and just a little bit in terms of other funds and general revenue dedicated funds. And this is, when looking at this other funds, that's going to be an interesting thing to look at when we get into the next section, where we start looking a little at business and economic development, because that kind of funds itself. You really don't have much in the way of health and human services where funds are collected that can pay for this. And this is one of the things that makes this a little controversial as well, especially since these are the individuals that implement Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, Child Protective Services, welfare spending, things like that, which of course aren't in a state like Texas necessarily that popular. Yeah. One of the things that, when Medicaid was actually passed, the idea was that states were going to be able to oversee the delivery of these particular services because they were in a better position to be able to say no, put limitations on who could get that.
Okay.
And if you want to, business and economic development,
all right,
just for a second,
business.
Stop with that. If we want to go a little bit further with some of the other ones, the regulatory structure is really fascinating. But in terms of business and economic development, you've got, again, a reduction, $40 billion previously to $36 billion. Let me repeat, I know I've mentioned this before, these are figures over a 2-year period of time. And again, other funds, that's number one, 58.7% other funds. And again, that, State Highway Fund, Texas Mobility Fund, things like that. You're paying into this every time you put gasoline into your tank. So that's what that black part of the pie chart is about. Federal funds, again, a lot of that is funding that comes from the Texas Department of Transportation. It's one of those areas where you see, the national, state, and local governments all involved in a particular area of public policy, getting people around.
Okay.
Commerce around as well, too. And in terms of general revenue funds, very little. In terms of general revenue dedicated funds. And if you see on the significant developments on the side, it mentions the Texas Workforce Commission. And of course, we do a lot of stuff that involves the Texas Workforce Commission here at the college.
Okay, so that's like training?
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be. Do they break down the usage of? Okay, well.
Well, if you scroll down a little bit more, figure 300, you see, what is it, 5 different agencies that get most of this money. They would get all of it. Department of Housing and Community Affairs, Texas Lottery Commission, Department of Motor Vehicles, Department of Transportation, and Texas Workforce Commission. By far, the largest, $30 billion out of the $35 billion, is Department of Transportation.
Wait, why would the Texas Lottery? I don't know anything about the Texas Lottery Commission. Aren't they supposed to make money, not use money?
Well, they do, but because it's a state agency, that's what your other funds are. When you're generating your own revenue.
Okay.
That's what. In fact, actually, we can scroll down a little bit, and they've got some stuff related to the Texas Lottery Commission.
But so this is $500 million for Texas Lottery Commission. Am I reading that right?
Well, $525 million. I mean, compared to
what do they do?
$30 billion.
What do they do with that?
Have you ever been to a convenience store and you're behind somebody who's just buying one scratch-off ticket after the other?
So wait, the Texas Lottery Commission, they are actually running the lottery?
Yeah.
There's not like a third party?
The scratch-offs, I don't think so. They don't. Now, the reason I was hesitant was because, we signed up to the, we used to have our own little Texas Lotto, but I guess now we signed up in whatever that, I don't play these things. I don't know. The little super duper lotto, Lucky Lotto, whatever the statewide thing is. But here's the thing. I'm glad you asked that question because there are answers that are in this document. If you want to scroll down a little bit. Well, you got this one little bit that talks generally about all these different things.
Okay, funding for the Texas Lottery Commission. So,
here, let's scroll down a little bit. We can see the Lottery Commission itself. I don't know what page it's on.
I'm looking at the section on page 441, and it says funding for the Texas Lottery Commission. So they're just talking about where the money's coming from.
Go down to 449, because that's dedicated to the lotto. Purpose: general revenue for the state through the management and sale of entertaining lottery products, and provide authorized organizations the opportunity to raise funds for their charitable purposes by conducting bingo. It used to be that you couldn't do anything like that legally. Law enforcement usually looked the other way. When I was a kid, you'd have the church would have bingo, and you'd have cops there that were just sort of like security, and maybe keeping other cops away. I don't know. Established 1993, Texas Government Code, Texas Lottery Commission, 5 members appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. And you can see the source of the revenue right here, mostly general revenue dedicated fund. And that's stuff that it kind of, develops itself, from its, let's see, appropriations include a decrease for contracts that promote lottery games, major funding. Yeah, if you look at 306, it says where the money is actually, where it's going.
Oh, I have no doubt that
Yeah.
it's going to great places. I'm just
Well,
I'm just wondering what they're spending the money on. I mean,
Well,
I
here,
guess
look at figure 306.
Okay.
Here you go. There's the answer to your
No, that's where
questions right here.
that's where their revenue from the lottery is going, right?
Yeah.
But the state gives money to the lottery commission in order to run the lottery, right?
Yes.
I'm just curious.
And a lot of it is stuff that it kind of generates. When you say general revenue dedicated funds, that's where this stuff is in fact actually coming from. Well, let's look. In 306 you see that no big surprise, about 2/3 of the money that's spent is prizes paid. These are the proceeds, and this is a little curious for me too. You got $8 billion, for proceeds. Foundation School Fund gets 24.3%. Which is a little bit shy of $2 billion. Retailer compensation, $432 million. Administration, $266. That's what it takes to run the thing. And then other state programs, $23 million. Let's see.
So if you play the lottery, you really are giving $1 to win an expected 66 cents, but hoping that you just get lucky and win millions. But it's essentially a 33% tax on the prize
Well, you're the
pool.
economist, so you can tell me that. I don't.
Well, I used to do this thing in class where they would calculate the expected value of playing various lottery games, and
Sure.
it's always negative. Like you can't expect, to to be a professional lottery player. What
What do you do for a living? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm a scratch. I do the scratch offs. Well, if you don't play, you can't win.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I always just kind of assumed that all these lottery things would just be outsourced to a third party, and then the state would just take a cut of it, and I didn't think they would actually be involved in the operations,
Dirty
or
hands.
spending money on the operations.
Are they too good for it? They're too good for running the lottery?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at that money and I'm like, really, $500 million to administer the lottery? I mean, I don't know the details of creating those tickets and things like that. So I don't know.
Well, like I said, this thing has just come out, so I'm not sure what the latest details are, so we can walk through that.
When was the last time, if you remember, when a commission was sunsetted?
Completely sunsetted, I can't recall, but I know the Texas Youth Commission I think it was the Texas Youth Commission. Anyway, but what was originally dealing with punishment for youths, they always get into trouble, and that was subsumed into another agency. Not too long ago, Health and Human Services was actually, it had 5 different agencies, but it was argued by the Sunset Commission that a lot of their functions overlapped.
Mm-hmm.
So it went from 5 separate ones to 3 separate ones, I guess, as a way to try to minimize administrative costs.
Yeah.
But it's a factual question. We could go back and look at that. We can look at the Sunset Commission's webpage and find that out.
I just wonder, just because in general you create a commission and usually they want to stay alive, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But that's why it. I guess it was a little bit controversial when they passed this thing up, and all of a sudden they have to justify themselves again. Are you in fact actually? Here, let's look at this. Since you mentioned that, Sunset's impact. I'm looking from the Texas Sunset Advisory Commission page. Its impact since 1977, 42 agencies and programs abolished, 52 agencies and programs abolished and transferred or consolidated, saving $1 billion in state and federal savings and revenue gains, and mentions oversight and whatnot. So there you go, 42 agencies abolished, 52.
42 agencies, commissions or agencies?
It says agencies and programs abolished.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's interesting.
Check that out.
All right. Anything else that we want to look at now?
That's probably plenty for right now. We can come back and, like I said, do this a little bit more. I mean, in terms of like the regulatory stuff especially, I think it's interesting.
Yeah, and this is fascinating. It's sort of a glimpse at what the government's like doing on a sort of a day-to-day basis.
It's a little bit more transparency in terms of function and also the money associated with it. It gives you an idea about priorities and, why the state does certain things. The reason we have Medicaid is because we get a lot of federal funds in order to run that thing.
Yeah, so much. I mean, that's another interesting thing about this is the amount of federal funds that are going into certain places.
Yes. It's the number one single source of revenue for the state of Texas.
Okay. Well, in the meanwhile, I'm going to go get a lottery ticket. So, Kevin, I'll see you probably next week.
I'm going to get a scratch off. We'll see you.
All right. Bye-bye.